Maybe one of the biggest questions that we have in our lives is, how do I decide how I'm supposed to follow Christ? What does Jesus want me to do? What am I called to do? And it can be very confusing. There are so many good things to do. There are so many options. We're blessed with choices. And so Ignatius had that same experience. He knew that there were a lot of different things that could be done. And he began to develop a sense of discerning spirits. What is the good spirit leading me towards? What are the temptation spirits trying to keep me from going to or lead me away from? So that when Jesuits or Saint Ignatius talks about discerning of spirits, he's really talking about, how do we understand what God wants for us, and to avoid things that are false, that are temptations that are not really what God wants for us, even if that other is a very good thing, a very notable thing. So the discernment of spirits, this discernment of goods, begins with a sense of, where am I? How do I feel? Who am I? What are my gifts and talents? You come into discernment with a certain reality of who you are. And then you begin to listen to the desires, to your own desires. Because unless you have the imagination to do something, more than likely you're not going to do it. Unless you have a sense that you can do it, you're not going to do it. So the beginning is with, who am I? Where am I? And then, what are the goods in front of me? What can I do with these gifts that I have? What do I do with the talents that I have? Then you have a series of options. They all are good. You can be paralyzed by that. You can say, well, I can't make up a decision. I won't do any of them. That's the first sign of a bad spirit: paralysis, inaction. And the 7 deadly sins, sloth, just sort of giving up because there's no way of making the right decision. But there is. Where do you find Jesus Christ? Where do you find the truest sense of following Jesus? What is it that gives you life because you know you're conforming yourself to what God has asked of you? There is an inner consolation, not, oh, I'm joyful, I'm happy, but a sense of, this is the right thing. This is where I'm supposed to be. And as soon as you say that, there's usually a confirmation in your soul. This is right. This is where I need to be. Ignatius also makes fairly clear that any discernment, any decision that touches on vocation in the church is going to be confirmed or not by the church. His great example was when he decided that he would go to the Holy Land. And his discernment was that he would stay there and spend his life there, working for the help of souls, for the conversion of souls. Well, the Franciscans who administered the Holy Land for the Latin Church decided differently. They didn't need another person wandering around trying to convert people and getting in trouble and being a problem. So they asked him to leave. While he initially thought that was the wrong thing, he realized that the church has the authority to confirm or to not confirm a discernment. And that's a very important part of the discernment process as well. Another thing that Ignatius points out in the exercises is that sometimes there's a clear desire, a clear call towards something that you can no longer do because of life choices that you've already made. If you feel called to the priesthood, but you're already married, at least in the Latin rite, that's going to keep things from going forward, or vice versa. If you're a priest and suddenly decide, oh, I should be a married person. All of these things are very practical aspects of the discernment process that we often forget. But the bottom line is being aware that there are many spirits moving us in different directions. And we have to be attentive to the one spirit that leads us always closer to Christ. Many times with conversion, there's a sense of I have it all figured out now. I know what God wants me to do. All I have to do is follow this path and everything is resolved. Most of us in our human experience know that this isn't true. That in fact, nothing is really decided forever. There's a sense of constant renewal, constant reform. Even in lifelong vocations, there's a need to renew the fervor of the vocation. And a discernment where you decide that you're going to, good example, you're going to follow Christ by being a monk, by living an ascetic life in a cell, in a hermitage. That may be the right decision. That may be where you need to be. And you may convince yourself that this is where God is calling you. But there's also the chance, the possibility that was a choice that was based on, this is the hardest thing that I can think to do. This would be the thing that would be closest to the cross. And so it's really important, especially in those kinds of life vocations, to be sure that the vocation is from God and not something that we convince ourselves because it's something that we would really like to do, or something that we feel like we have to do because that's how we earn God's love. It's really important in the discernment process to realize and to begin from the fact that you're loved by God. You're loved by God in the midst of your sinfulness and as you're making the decision. God is not going to love you more or less by the decision that you make. That gives you the freedom to be as attentive as you can to what God really wants, and not something simply that you think either God should want me to do because I want to do it, or something I have to do because I don't want to do it. In both of those cases, you can make mistakes that can be very, very difficult to overcome. And that's why it's also always important to continue to be aware of God's presence in your life and the refinements of the vocation. What is God calling me to greater depth? How is God calling me to make my relationship with the Lord that much stronger? I think the biggest challenge for all of us as followers of Jesus Christ is to be sure that what we're doing is what God wants us to do. And there's always going to be moments of self-doubt. Am I doing this because I want to do it, or am I doing it because this is truly the will of God? How do I know the difference? In the end, it's an act of faith. I have to believe this is what God calls me to, and I'm not teasing myself or kidding myself about this. If we're kidding ourselves, if we're trying to do our own will, that will become clear at some point. And that's, again, why it's very important not to try and hide things from yourself. I think people don't realize how easy it is to do that we can say, well, I'll just keep working at this until I get good at it. I'm just going to keep doing this until God tells me to do something different. It's a way of sort of not embracing the fact that this may not be where God is calling you at this point. And it becomes very complicated because we want, most of us anyway, want to come to a complete closure and a complete certitude and a complete sense that I'm doing God's will perfectly. And that never happens, because ultimately our human sinfulness keeps us from hearing God's will perfectly clearly. We're always going to have some self-doubt. But the more faithful we are to the basics of following Christ, of being aware of what we bring to Christ and offer of ourselves freely, the closer we are to being sure that this is God's will.